We have a really distinguished panel today of experts who are going to talk to you about this topic. I'd like to thank the Campbell Foundation, the UC Berkeley Social Science Matrix, the Resources Legacy Fund, the Cal Agricultural Natural Resources Department, and Berkeley Rasser for supporting our research. Don't forget, you can see our past webinars at our website, crc.berkeley.edu. We typically post webinars a couple of weeks after they air live. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Hekia Bodwitch.
Thank you, Laura. So today's panel is titled Cannabis, Labor, Agriculture, and Markets. And to kind of give an introduction to the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley and to some of the regulatory issues around labor, agriculture, and markets that I find particularly compelling. I'm just going to give a little bit of a vignette into my foray into the cannabis space. My background is in research with small-scale indigenous fishers, and I have family in the cannabis industry. And in 2015, 2016, I'd spent a decent amount of time working with small-scale indigenous fishers in New Zealand who were currently trying to rebuild small-scale operations and support local fishing communities in the context of a highly consolidated fishing industry that was dominated by about 3 major players. And the story these fishers told me was that in the 1980s, when the government was regulating the fishery, they had not been reporting their catches and they didn't get licensed. As a result, they were not able to participate in legal sales and faced years of exclusion, and their communities suffered. Coming back to California, as cannabis was being legalized in 2016 for recreational use, I heard farmers talking about, should we go legal? Should we still keep participating in the illicit economy, which is, immediately more lucrative? What are the trade-offs? And I sought to better understand, what these trade-offs were between this decision to stay illicit or to go legal, and potentially think through how policies could be designed to support these small-scale farmers. In conversation with Van Butzik, Eric Bieber, and others at UC Berkeley, and we developed through these conversations the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley, which promotes interdisciplinary scholarship on the social and environmental dimensions of cannabis through research and engagement with community, government, and academic entities, advances understanding of cannabis in socio-ecological systems at local, national, and global scales. And the center seeks to inform public dialogue and contribute to the development of prosperous, equitable communities and healthy environments. So within this work that the center is doing, and some of my work in the center, I think there's several aspects of cannabis legalization that are particularly interesting from the perspective of folks, myself included, who work on environmental policies related to a variety of sectors. The first is that legalization went into place with a series of regulatory initiatives that farmers have to comply with and producers have to comply with that are totally unprecedented for agricultural crop production more broadly. Farmers have to report their water use. They also have to adhere to certain standards for where they're planting, how they're monitoring labor coming in and out of their facility, and how they're monitoring crops coming in and out of their facilities as well. And these standards, the possibility to implement them was tied to the idea that cannabis didn't really have a huge lobbying force at the time of legalization. So the idea that regulations would hurt their bottom line didn't really hold in the way it does for other ag sectors and fishing industries. The other aspect I think that's unusual about the legalization initiative that's potentially significant in the context of other crops or other commodities is the the prevalence of small-scale producers at the time of legalization and the explicit efforts within regulatory initiatives, including certain equity initiatives, to support smallholders. So these two kind of factors combined, these standards that are really kind of stringent as compared to other sectors, and also this prevalence of small-scale producers creates a moment in the legalization landscape, at least from my vantage point, where, you know, if we get these regulations right, we might be able to support a industry that supports communities as well as environmental and social outcomes. So our panelists today are going to be talking about some of the work they've been engaged in trying to work towards those goals. And by way of introduction, we have Eduardo Blanco, an attorney for the Agriculture Labor Relations Board, a state agency. He has previously spoken at NCIA, CCIA events, and to gatherings of cannabis cultures throughout the state, raising awareness about the function and importance of the labor law to cultivators and their employees. We have Stella Beckhaman, an epidemiologist and study coordinator of cannabis-related projects at UC Davis Western Center for Agriculture, Health, and Safety. Amber Center, a cannabis entrepreneur and founder of Supernova Woman nonprofit. Their Equity Works initiative is a model for workforce development and shared kitchen manufacturing space. And Keith Taylor, UC Davis Department of Human Ecology, professor of cooperative extension and community economic development at Davis, focusing on community wealth building through business and economic development policy and organizational and community governance practice. Dr. Taylor's research focuses on the ways that California's Prop 64 legal regime engages diverse communities in the newly created economic opportunities of cannabis legalization. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Eduardo.
And like Hekia said, my name is Eduardo Blanco, and I am an attorney with the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. And I'm going to try to touch on a number of topics in the time I have here. A little bit about what we do at the ALRB, and then unionization and the role of labor peace agreements, the demographics of cannabis farming, the potential impact from federal legalization and immigration reform on that demographic, the potential impacts from innovations in technology, the possibility for use in cannabis farming of the H-2A agricultural guest worker visa program, and the new farm workers coming from Southern Mexico and Central America, workers who only speak indigenous languages. So at the ALRB, we protect the rights of farm workers to unionize and also to be able to raise issues about working conditions with their employers. And this does apply to cannabis farming. The unionization in cannabis, I think, is significantly helped by the existence of this process called labor peace agreements, which allows union organizers to be able to come onto the property and speak to workers there at the workplace. This is a process that doesn't exist in any other industry in California or in any other part of agriculture. So I think it gives unions a particular opportunity that they don't otherwise have in order to have these face-to-face meetings with workers, to explain to them the benefits of unionization, and then to convince them that they will be better off in their work life if they join the union and elect that union to represent them. In the last couple of years, COVID has shelved that process. But I think that in 2022, we're going to see a resurgence of it, mainly because of the vaccination rates and now workplace vaccination requirements that will be in place as of January. And we will see if what the unions have to say to the employees convince them that they will be better off with that representation. But if they are convinced and we start seeing elections and we start seeing collective bargaining agreements, the impact of that will be felt throughout the entire industry, wherever it starts, whether it's going to be in agriculture or other sectors of the cannabis industry. I think the impact and reverberations will be felt all the way through. Now, the demographics of the cannabis farming employee, haven't been too many studies done on this, but from what has been done so far, it shows that those employees are pretty much young and white. And I would also think that they are probably not very, they don't really have an agricultural background and don't understand a lot about agricultural techniques, so they require a lot of education on that part. The potential impact from a legalization at the federal level on that demographic, I think it goes this way. One of the obstacles to workers coming from Mexico, where most agricultural workers do come from in this state, entering into cannabis comes from the fact that it is near automatic deportation if they are found to be working in cannabis, because it would be a drug-related felony, and that is a status-wise, that is automatic deportation from this country, which still is in place. Now, if as part of the president's Build Back Better plan, there are immigration reforms, which would essentially create an amnesty program. And if that does pass with the immigration reform still in there, then I also see that that will have an impact, because then workers would be also under that level allowed to work in cannabis legally. And so either or of those barriers being lifted, I think workers from regular ag will be coming into cannabis, because comparatively the work is less strenuous than other kinds of agriculture, and the wages are higher in cannabis farming than they are otherwise in the rest of agriculture. Now, I think there is a possibility as well for the use of in cannabis farming of the H-2A agricultural guest worker program. That's a trend that's happening in the rest of agriculture and gaining speed because of the labor shortages in ag, caused in part by COVID. If immigration reform does take place, in the past, amnesty programs have seen folks move out of agriculture into other types of work, like, for example, construction. So if that kind of thing happens, then because cannabis farming isn't allowed to use H-2A at this point, that may be an opportunity that opens up for them if shortages continue. And lastly, the new farm workers coming from southern Mexico and Central America do not speak Spanish. They only speak an indigenous language. There's a variety of indigenous languages out there that are spoken. And so being monolingual in that way, it poses, I think, a lot of challenges for employers in agriculture, and also for state agencies, and being able to reach them and speak to them about what their rights are and protections are at the workplace. So these are challenges that I think that are going to be faced by the cannabis industry in the future. And I think it would behoove the industry to start pre-positioning itself to deal with those kinds of issues as they're going to be coming forward, as it is also on us as state agencies to do the same thing.
Thank you, Eduardo. That's really important points around unionizing, the impact of federal legalization, and the ways the industry might want to be aligning itself looking forward. So thank you. So next up, we have Stella Backfin.
Thank you. I'm an epidemiologist and study coordinator at the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, and we've had a few cannabis worker health projects that have all been led by the founding director of the center, Dr. Mark Schenker. Right now, we are working, why is my screen share not working? There we go. Right now, we're working on this really exciting project with the UC Berkeley Health Initiative of the Americas that's based on focus groups and interviews with cannabis workers. We're talking mostly to Latino, seasonal, and immigrant trimmers up in remote areas of Northern California. And our early insights from this are painting a really different picture of the industry than what we've gotten talking to licensed business owners and the more sort of populated area cannabis workers. We also had a pilot study where we went to 2 grows in the Davis area, and we did see some elevated incidents of work-related symptoms, as well as symptoms that could indicate asthma. And in July, we held an online meeting looking to prioritize the research, regulatory, and outreach needs for protecting worker health in the cannabis industry. So instead of trying to present, a lightning overview of cannabis worker health and safety, I'm just going to share some highlights from this meeting. So during our presentations and discussions, a number of hazards obviously were identified, and the ones that sort of came up over and over again were electrical hazards, sort of impromptu, substandard wiring, people who don't really know what they're doing, setting up wiring, and then really just the remote locations of a lot of these grows. They might be hours away from first responders, and it's pretty common that they might not even have an emergency plan on what they'll do if somebody using a chainsaw amputates part of their body. There's also chemical and biological exposures, pesticides, fertilizers, the cannabis plant itself, powdery mildew, and what our meeting participants identified as the big hazard issues were unsafe use of trimming machines, which has been resulting in amputations, finger amputations, pesticide exposure, allergen exposure, wildfires, which was a newer issue to come up, and then also the effects of isolation and the potential for violence in this industry. For health effects, just to start out with, so existing research in this industry is really minimal. The body of research is growing, but a lot of what we're looking at is inferring the risks of other agricultural workplaces without really knowing how much the unique factors of the cannabis industry will mediate those risks. What we have been seeing is allergic sensitization to the cannabis plant, respiratory issues, injuries up to fatalities, and then repetitive motion injuries, which actually you might think they would be hand and wrist injuries, but we're seeing more lower back injuries. The priority issues that we identified were respiratory effects. Again, workplace violence comes up, chemical exposures, and also physical exposures, which are things like those electrical hazards, ladder falls, things of that nature. And over again during this meeting, and when we talk to cannabis workers and cannabis business owners, what comes up is that there isn't enough training. Workers are not being trained and educated enough. The on-the-job education might be one demo of how to use a tool, or even look something up on YouTube and figure out how to do it. So there's a great need for training, and for that to occur, there needs to be more materials that are specific to the hazards of the cannabis industry, and then also that are culturally appropriate. This is a unique industry. Our participants talk about, things like even TikTok videos as being more approachable than what we in occupational health have kind of traditionally provided, which is like, a pamphlet or a poster. So that needs to be considered. And the training and education priorities that were identified were, again, workplace violence comes up, preventing and responding to that. Pesticide use, machine use and maintenance, those trimming machines come up again. And then also I just got lost because I can't see my last bullet point. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, respiratory and allergic sensitization. Sorry about that. That was what I had to share, and I'm really happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Stella. That raises really interesting questions about what unionization might look like in these remote contexts. Amber, we have you up next.
My name is Amber Center. I'm an entrepreneur in cannabis. I have cannabis operations throughout the state of California with a few facilities in Oakland and one in LA. And I'm also executive director and co-founder of Supernova Women. Supernova Women is a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 2015 with the mission of empowering Black and Brown people in cannabis and creating opportunities for them in the legal cannabis market. So wanted to talk a bit about some of the things that Supernova has done as far as social equity goes in cannabis in California and really also beyond California. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So as I just mentioned, Supernova. And like I just mentioned, we're a 501c3 nonprofit with the mission of education, advocacy, and network building are kind of the three pillars of things that we focus on. And a couple of things that we've done in cannabis in California. We did work with the city of Oakland to establish the first social equity program in the country. We also worked with the city of San Francisco to establish the second social equity program in the country. And then we worked with Senator Stephen Bradford's office at the state to craft SB 1294, which is the Cannabis Social Equity Act of 2018, which now funds all of the local social equity programs throughout the state of California. So our organization has really been at the forefront of the fight for social equity in cannabis, leading the charge around advocacy and just working to lower barriers of entry and create opportunities for Black and Brown folks in cannabis. And I'm going to talk about some of the programs that we've offered. One of the unique things about our organization is that we are all led by women of color that are also business owners and license owners in cannabis. So the whole board is comprised of operators and owners and women of color that understand the plight of Black and Brown folks in cannabis. And we've done a couple of cool things in 2020 and 2021. In 2020, we launched Equity Works Incubator, which is a shared manufacturing facility in Oakland. So there is a license type in California that allows for something of a co-op type of model in manufacturing. It's called an S-type license, shared manufacturing license. And with that license, a number of different operators can use the same license space. They just have to be in there at their own independent times. They can't overlap or be in there at the same time. But this really lowers the barrier of entry for manufacturers and operators because they don't have that huge upfront cost of having to pay for this whole facility and get this whole facility licensed on their own. So Oakland took it a step further and created basically a grant program or a contract which allowed for operators like me who won the contract to create a space for shared manufacturing for social equity operators. So my space is actually funded with money from GoBiz that the city has gotten from the state. So this is a state and city funded program. And what we've been doing is incubating 6 social equity operators and helping them create products and then facilitating getting those products from concept to the market. So the program has been going on for about 18 months now, and it's been going very well. We have some operators that are doing fantastic. Some operators that are using the space just for R&D, but some that are actually figuring out and really scaling their products. So that's been exciting to watch. In addition to that, Oakland also established a workforce development program for social equity workers, which was interesting because this now not just focuses on social equity operators and creating opportunities and ownership, but now brings even more equity to the community in offering training for folks that fit a social equity worker definition. So the city of Oakland issued $40,000 grants for almost 30, I believe, equity operators to train and recruit and retain a social equity workforce. So Supernova put together a workforce development program that offers training at Equity Works Incubator. And basically these workers now support the operators that are in the shared manufacturing facility. The workforce development program is a paid program where the workers are paid $20 an hour. They are trained in 2 tracks, manufacturing as well as metric and compliance. We chose those 2 tracks because obviously it's a manufacturing facility, so that made a lot of sense. But also metric and compliance because every single cannabis company needs a metric and compliance specialist. We had 6 fellows in the cohort, and we partnered with a staffing agency to help us recruit from these communities because it was such a niche kind of type of worker that we were looking for. We thought it would be difficult, but it actually wasn't. It's pretty easy for us to recruit folks for the program. And yeah, it's been a really successful program, and we're looking to expand it to San Francisco in 2023.
Thank you, Amber.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. It's awesome to hear about the equity initiatives and how that's underway. Keith, you're up.
I really like hearing what everyone's doing, and I'm trying to stay below the glare of my bright and sunshiny Davis office here. So it's really interesting to hear what everyone else is working on with regard to kind of understanding what's happening with the workforce, how we can make sure that cannabis is far more equitable in the impacts to the communities and stakeholders. When I arrived in California in 2017 and I started kicking around in the cannabis space, I was really interested in how Proposition 64 initially was passed with these ideas of we're going to benefit all these communities, all these marginalized folks that had traditionally been negatively impacted by the war on drugs and all these sort of things. But as I started digging into a lot of the policy, it was pretty clear to me that there was sort of a if you build it, they will come kind of idea here. That clearly the thinking was market forces will come into play and these things will benefit folks that had been at the margins in cannabis. As cannabis grows, it'll lift all boats with the rising tide, right? I was very dubious of that because I've observed this in other economic development scenarios. This rarely ever happens. So I'm Keith Taylor. I'm a professor of extension and community economic development. What I want to talk about today is diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of Proposition 64 promises broken. Our research team, just real quick, I work with my colleague here at UC Davis, Gwen Arnold. We've got a really great student research team, Taylor Giamo and Parisa Kavusi. And then we've got colleagues at New York University and The Ohio State as well. So it's been a pretty great team, brings a lot of interdisciplinarity. The question that we had going into this study that we've been doing for 2 years now is how does Prop 64's delegation to local government affect community economic development, diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes? One of the interesting features of the California legalization regime, sort of this delegation down to the local level. If you go to a place like Colorado, Colorado is very state centralized in how they go about things. Yet California claims that they're going to make all these diversity, equity, inclusion positive impacts. You hear all these things about the opportunities for legalization, what it's going to do. So economic impacts, government revenues, savings from criminal justice, and business expansion. Okay. So economic impacts, clearly they're pretty huge. 16 to 19 billion US cannabis sales. Government revenue, supposed to be quite a bit. I think that they've actually come in under projections in California, and recently they've caught up. So there's been some issues there which are indicative of some of the things I'm going to talk about. And then equity and justice too. people of color have largely been more marginalized by the industry. And as I get out and do field work, I've observed that there's not really as much equity inclusion as was originally pledged to be. I'm pleased to see there's efforts like Amber here on our panel trying to purposely intervene. We need more of that for sure. So, where I come from is, is community economic development orientation. We have all these tools in our community economic development toolbox, but we tend to reach only for a couple of these tools. Attraction, retention, workforce development, industrial clusters, and creative class. These are sort of the 4 areas we look at. We talk about stakeholder investment, stakeholder empowerment. A lot of our local economic development folks are involved. That becomes a problem whenever our state policy then delegates down to the locals, and the locals tend to give to the economic development institutions. So, what then happens with things like small and medium enterprise and the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion with labor and stakeholder ownership? Why aren't the consumers allowed to have a voice in this? Why aren't the workers? Why aren't the manufacturers? Why aren't the growers? There's some real issues that come into play. So our study design, what we've been working on, we asked a research question about what are the effects of the delegation to local government. We've been doing this long-term case study in Mendocino County. The methods that we've been using are participant observation, interviews, surveys, and network analysis. We've had quite a bit of exposure to a number of folks. So not only have we had, I believe it's 60 or 70 different interviews, but we've had quite a bit of exposure time as well in the county, which adds to the validity of our findings. So the findings of what's been going on with this implementation of Prop 64 at the local level, everyone's impacted, though some more than others. It's been a big mess. Mendocino County is not the only place. Other counties have had major challenges, but I can tell you that the new entrants in the markets, they're funded through venture capital and whatnot, are able to weather a lot of the ups and downs than the traditional, the legacy, and the new small entrants in this space. Part of this is because of the unnecessary regulatory burdens, the costs, the additional taxes, and all these sort of things. Really has an inordinate impact on small. With that, there's a ton of missed opportunities that the state law is not controlling for. Stakeholder voice, control, and equity are basically left out of the intention of these policies. It's sort of like let the markets play out as they will in many ways. But also, we sort of throw all these resources out there saying, of course, these folks are going to be able to be lifted up and have an opportunity here. And then we're saying, have at it, folks. And they're going, well, but there's no support system here. If you're a big enterprise, if you're funded with Altria money, for example, you're able to tap into kind of mentors and VC and tax advice and these sort of things. But if you're growing on a half-acre plot, you don't have these same resources. Also, the next thing that I want to really draw folks' attention to is that local does not necessarily always mean equitable. There's long-standing rifts in communities such as Mendocino between people in power and the cannabis interests. So now what we're basically saying is those folks that are in power, here's these resources to help grow this sector. Help out these folks that you've been in opposition and loggerhead with for decades. And these folks are like, I can drag my heels now. So there's not really much of a check and balance coming in from the state to watch out for this behavior at the local level. Beyond that, beyond colliding with the local power structures, there's just basic capacities in some of these areas. If you've been to Mendocino or Humboldt or Stanislaus, you know that these are very isolated, hard to get to regions. They're sprawling, they're really challenged with their government resources. So their capacities are minimalized. And now the state's expecting them to do all of these regulatory burdens. So they pass on a lot of the costs to the operators themselves. And on top of that, since they're not getting a lot of guidance, according to our findings, what happens is the implementation, the compliance ends up being quite burdensome and complex.
Thank you, Keith. And thanks everyone for some great presentations. I think there's several interesting themes that are coming out of here. And one is this idea of, how we conceptualize equity and the way in which regulatory initiatives can be designed to foster more equitable outcomes going forward. We had Eduardo talking a bit about the role of unions and unionization. We had Stella discussing ideas of worker health and safety as important, also perhaps as a metric of equity. It wasn't directly described in that way, but we might consider it as such. Amber talking explicitly about the equity programs, and then Keith's conceptions of equity in relationships between smallholders and larger operations with outside capital coming in. And one of the questions I have, and this is hopefully of interest more broadly, is the question of what specific policy recommendations or policy changes might we want to see to support equity going forward, regardless of how or you know, and I guess as you're answering this applies to each panelist, but as you're answering, you know, maybe defining also how you're conceiving of equity in that definition.
So one of the things that popped up, folks who know my work have called me Co-op Keith because I do a lot of research around cooperative enterprise. So a lot of the small and legacy farmers in Mendocino wanted to talk with me about forming a co-op. And one of the peculiarities of Proposition 64 is they have this statute in there for a co-op cannabis association. It is ridiculous. It treats cannabis co-ops as if there's something different from, let's say, a Sunkist or a Blue Diamond and these sort of things. One of the things I'd like to see happen is basically that statute just gets struck altogether. Just remove it. And just let's default to the standard agricultural cooperative statutes. The good thing is there's been some folks that have quite a bit of legal acumen. There's this Uplift co-op, I think in Petrolia. And what they said is, why can't we just incorporate as a regular ag co-op? And so they tested it and they were able to do that. So then I've gone back to other folks since then. And essentially what happens is with this Cannabis Co-op Alliance statute in Prop 64, it serves as a distraction. It makes folks think that this is how you have to form a cannabis co-op when you can actually do it in a traditional manner. So that'd be the one thing that I can think about that can be restructured early on to help out with equity and participation.
Thank you. Does other panelists perhaps have thoughts on policy changes that might be needed?
Yeah, one thing that I would add is that when you look at how equity is defined within the purview of the Department of Cannabis Control, and then localities who are getting these grants from the DCC, is how the term technical assistance is being defined. And that goes more to, my concern is that it's kind of narrow. It's not broad enough to include the kind of things that that agencies that are doing outreach and education in the cannabis space are trying to achieve, because we see in order to successfully be a business, you need to understand HR. You need to understand HR rules, because this is a place that is a hill where a lot of companies get dinged so much by the fines and penalties that are out there that each agency has, that if you don't have a profit margin, the kinds of margins that I think Keith and Amber were talking about that some companies do and other companies don't, you're not going to make it because you're going to fail just on that basis alone. And so we're trying to provide that kind of education, and particularly in the social equity space, because you know, these are brand spanking new employers who don't have any background, don't understand what these rules are, don't have the resources to hire an HR consultant, an HR department, or an HR attorney specialist to provide that information, but we can give them the basics. But if these programs that the state has and localities have to help the equity entrepreneurs out don't see that as important, don't define technical assistance to include that, then how are these companies going to get that education in a way that's meaningful for them as they try to succeed?
So in occupational health, I think the big blocker to health equity is just the big difference in between the licensed and the legacy businesses and the resources they have and the impetus they have to do things like provide training. And given the shortcomings of training and care for worker health in sort of the big businesses, like, you know, the big licensed businesses, the drop off to then people who are, you know, paid under the table in cash trimming up north, it's just always going to be huge. And there needs to be more reasons for people to become licensed. And then even among those businesses, there needs to be more support for meeting occupational health and safety requirements. One thing I didn't have time to touch on was that Prop 64 does have a requirement for it's an OSHA 30 training class, a 30-hour health and safety training class for a manager and a worker at businesses. But for a lot of reasons, including COVID, that's really not being enforced even under the best of circumstances. So more support for those sorts of existing policies being enforced would also make a big difference.
Thanks, Stella. That kind of echoes Eduardo's point about, you know, services the state can provide to help perhaps reduce some barriers to compliance. Amber.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of echo what both Eduardo and Stella are saying, but a bit different spin. Really, the system and how it was built, the licensing system, the compliance, the regulations, they're not equitable at all. And, you know, it would have been great for it to been built equitably from the beginning, and instead of just making a bunch of programs and doing a lot of patchwork and tacking things on at the end. You know, we have such a huge, thriving, unregulated market because there's no incentive for these operators to transition over. And it's because there's no margins in the regulated market. The margins are so slim. It's very hard. It's hard to navigate. The cost of compliance is outrageous. And, you know, like lower the taxes and allow people to actually make a living in the industry. And then you will see a thriving legal market. But until then, we're going to continue to have these conversations and have these battles and talk about how we should wage a war on drugs 2.0 by creating these task force and enforcement on these unregulated operators without giving them a real pathway to even be legal.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, that the regulations are only going to have an effect to the extent that people can afford the costs of being legal. Van has a question from the audience here. We hear about labor shortage. This is from Van Botzek. Is there a labor shortage in cannabis?
Well, that is a good question. There is a labor shortage in other parts of the agricultural industry. I think that's been documented and recently commented upon by some of the ag economic professors at UC Davis. So I'm not sure that there is one necessarily at that same level or rate that it's going on in the rest of ag. But I don't know that there have been really any studies up to this point in time to say either way on that point. I would think because of the fact that cannabis does have higher wages, that if folks are leaving the rest of ag, that they would be going into looking at cannabis as a potential place to have employment. But the impact of COVID is one of the things that I think, given the fact that cannabis and ag were both labeled as essential industries, well, what happens is that that have the tendency to expose people probably more to getting COVID if they were there working and folks maybe weren't masking or vaccinated, that kind of thing. So the potential, I think, was there for more folks to get ill. But COVID, I think, has had an impact on the ag industry in general, and that is part of why there has been a labor shortage there.
Great, thank you, Eduardo. We have another question here from the audience, Seth LaRosa. It is my understanding that Mendocino County is not currently issuing permits. How can producers comply with the state law absent the ability to become permitted within the county? I don't think Mendocino is the only place where this is the case.
Yeah, I'll give a quick response to that. What I'm hearing from the growers in Mendocino is just they're just beside themselves. They can't believe that this is where they're at. They just feel like the system is ignoring them, and then they feel these other pressures from CEQA compliance and everything else that's coming down the pipeline. So yeah, it's a real issue there, and I don't know how you run a system this way.
If folks on the panel have questions for each other, please go ahead and raise them. But I have other or another dynamic that I think is maybe worth speaking to is this question of unionizing labor that Eduardo brought up. So, how does unionizing labor happen, especially when it's maybe been difficult to unionize workforces in other sectors? And then what does the unionization of labor mean for the smallholder or the equity, initiative where, they're barely able to comply to begin with? How does a unionized workforce intersect with the costs that smallholders are already facing to become part of the market?
I would love to talk a bit about small businesses and equity businesses and unions. So, I grew up in a union household in the Midwest. My mom was a member of IBEW, International Brotherhood for Electrical Workers. The union helped my family very much. So I hold the union in high regard there. And I've seen the impacts on how it has really helped my family. So that being said, being a small operator here in California, engaging with equity operators and small businesses, really cannabis is in California is primarily small business. Most businesses are small, and labor unions were not created for small businesses. They were created for businesses that have employees of 50 plus. And that is just not cannabis in California. So the labor unions have been burdensome for small business, not sustainable for small business. I ran and was the chief operations officer of Magnolia, Oakland, in West Oakland, which was the first unionized dispensary in California. And that was definitely a burden and ended up being the demise of that dispensary because the costs of maintaining the agreement, the MOU, was just too much for the small business to bear. And that really worries me for cannabis in California. We have to have labor peace agreements with businesses as small as 10 employees. How do we protect these workers for small businesses? how do we offer worker protections that are union focused for small businesses without being so burdensome that it is not sustainable?
If I may add to what Amber's saying, I see this in other areas too, where a lot of unions have been going after Walmart, for example, for years, and they've been unsuccessful, but now they're focused on grocery. So they go after things like independent grocers and small food cooperatives. And it's a very difficult business proposition. Instead, I think that there could be better conversations to be had about some sort of equity stake, where as time goes on, the business grows, then there's some benefits to be had. But I tend to agree with Amber on this, that the union relationship with small businesses has to change in some way, and it needs to be a more dynamic conversation other than just locking in union contracts. And I myself am a major union supporter, but I'm seeing this firsthand. I agree. It pains me to say it, but it really is a burden if it's not done properly, and often it's not.
I don't disagree with what's being said in terms of the impacts on small businesses from unionization. I think what's happening in the cannabis industry that I'm seeing is that the focus has been on trying to organize the larger, to Amber's point, the larger companies. So the efforts have been made, like I guess, like at somebody like MedMen, so we're talking more at the other, away from agriculture and towards the other end, towards going towards the retail end, where companies may tend to be bigger. But ultimately, when these contracts are starting to be achieved, they have a downward pressure, right? Because they're setting the wages, they're setting the health and benefits and retirement benefits and all that kind of thing. They're setting like a floor of what employees will be coming to expect from any employer in terms of these kinds of wages and benefits packages and scenarios. So it does, it then puts more pressure on smaller employers as how do they compete with that. But at the same time, Keith mentioned Walmart. So at the same time, large employers are very sophisticated in how they battle unions. They can be, we talk about an old term in labor law is the iron fist and the velvet glove. The approach that employers can take is either the iron fist to really smash union efforts by firing employees, by coercing other employees not to support unions, by lying to employees about what unions are about. That's one approach. The other approach is the velvet glove, by trying to, promise things to employees if they don't go unionized, and then, later on taking off that velvet glove and using the iron fist again. So, there are plenty of obstacles to unions being able to organize any industry, and that includes cannabis. Although many cannabis employers have expressed a desire to support their employees in terms of whatever their employees want, including if employees want unionization, that they are all for that. But that again remains to be seen, because we haven't seen really that. Well, we haven't really seen any contracts come out that have received any notoriety in the cannabis industry. Now, I think one of the things that's going to be happening, and we haven't really talked about, is when the limitations on size of operations comes off, I think in 2023, and the expectation that I've heard all along is that a lot of the big players nationally are going to come in. We're talking big pharma, big tobacco, big alcohol, going to come in and basically take over the industry. And then that creates employers of the size that do attract unions and who they want within their, I guess if you use the word, portfolio. And so I don't really see really major efforts to organize in the cultivation space. because as Amber's saying, there just aren't that many at this point in time, that many big operations under the licensing structure that currently exists that has limitations on total square foot or total acreage, particularly with outdoor, operations.
So from Theo Whitcomb from High Country News, a reporter, he's been working on stories about the illicit market in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And in these poor rural counties with budget crises, law enforcement tends to be the primary regulatory force regarding the proliferation of illicit operations. And as Theo's saying, because of drought and COVID, farm workers are forced to move into this incredibly precarious illicit industry. And because of immigration status, many run from cops during raids. When it comes to addressing worker concerns in rural counties where police essentially lead regulation, what approach can unions or the state take in helping vulnerable workers caught between law enforcement and exploitation, such as wage theft, violence, and injury? So a different take on what these small or what these farms are up to, I suppose, than what we're seeing in perhaps Oakland with the equity initiatives, or some of the farms that Keith's working with in Mendocino.
Yeah, there's an intersection between two issues that I think that we are very cognizant of. One is the need to educate employees in the cannabis space, no matter what part of the industry they're in, because if they're coming from a legacy perspective, or if they're coming in as young people who don't have any background in being employees, they're not really aware of the protections that are out there for them, the rules that employers have to follow. And so we're trying to find ways to educate employees. Hopefully we can work like this program that Amber was talking about that Oakland has, and hopefully that is a program that will expand around the state in terms of equity employees, and hopefully we'll be able to talk with them. The other aspect is, as unions organize, we've been talking to unions about, well, we would like to speak to the folks you're trying to organize to help them understand what their protections are from the state. But at the same time, when we're looking at the illicit part of the industry, we recognize, I think the agencies recognize that those are they being precarious situations for employees, are also dangerous situations for folks trying to speak to workers coming from the different agencies. If we're going to be doing that out there where they're working, that those are situations that could be very dangerous for those state agents, particularly if we're talking as we may be in upper Northern California about cartel operated illegal operations. So the desire is not to put state employees in harm's way. So that does have a negative impact there. But can we use social media? Stella was talking, I think, about TikTok and the ways that the part of the population that is in there using social media, and that happens to be a significant part of the profile of the current demographic of cannabis. Can we, as state agencies, get more into using that to speak to workers? It's happening. It's been happening recently with COVID, trying to educate farm workers about the safety protocols that they can follow to protect themselves, how they can get vaccines and where they can go to get them, and the state helping them to do that. And I understand that process has been successful. So maybe that is a way that we, generally speaking, as agencies, can start doing more of to reach employees and help educate them in that illicit space about what their rights are, and hopefully that they'll be able to at some point be able to come to us with these issues, and we'll be able to do something about them. But trying to do those things without the assistance of law enforcement at this point in time probably is, from the management perspective of agencies, is not something that I think they're really that interested in doing.
That makes sense. Thank you, Eduardo. Do the panelists have any questions for each other?
I also have one question I'd give to Amber, which is the initiative that she's working on with her colleagues and peers. Is there a strategy around scale of taking it to other communities and interlocking it?
Yeah, definitely. We would love to. The challenge around that is, these programs that we're operating pull money from state funds, which has been issued to the cities. So there's obviously, there's lots of grant writing and things like that that have to happen, but the cities have to have some sort of an equity program and a mechanism to do all this, which most do not. So while the potential is there, certainly to scale to other places, we have to have that infrastructure set up to be able to actually get the work done. And that's going to require tons of advocacy, all that good stuff.
So we have one more question here from the audience, which is I think interesting question in relationship between the role of the state in this regulatory process. The comment is saying here, first of all, that 80% of licensed cannabis is diverted, I think, to the illicit market. And most cultivators I've met have not read regulations. Are those who are struggling with being licensed, isn't this some fault of their own? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an interesting point regarding, what is the state? Who, who's responsible for these transitions, and who does the state work for?
Well, ultimately, our role is to protect employees, right? So, and to that extent, we can just be out there right now, all of the different agencies just going ahead and doing enforcement. But, ultimately, what good does that do in terms of supporting an industry which the people of the state of California voted on to create, help create and help, and their desire be successful. So we can only achieve that by trying to be out there, by trying to be very proactive and trying to educate as many employers in the industry about what these rules are. When it comes down to when we get to the enforcement phase, the old phrase that ignorance is no excuse is going to apply. And at that point, well, if you didn't take advantage of these opportunities to come and hear us, folks like myself, we partner with Cal OSHA, we partner with Fair Employment and Housing, for example, and do these Zoom events around the state. If you didn't come and listen to us, if you didn't come and listen to the environmental agencies talk about, water CEQA requirements and all that kind of stuff, then ultimately, it is on you. And when we get to that enforcement phase, well, you're going to have to deal with those consequences. But we're trying our best to be proactive, and all we can do is put it out there. And it's not like it's not quite like that baseball movie analogy. If you build it, they'll come. They may not come because that's a choice. And so in that sense, they have a choice to make because we're there, we're doing it. If they don't want to come, then ultimately they'll have to face the consequences of that when they get enforced against.
And I have a thought on that. I do understand a lot. There does seem to be this sort of desire to point fingers in a lot of this. And I think what it is, there's just a lot of moving parts here. So I'm very reluctant to say like one group is responsible without the other. Boy, it sure would be nice if there's some sort of like reconciliation thing to happen to help smooth all this out. The one thing I'll say that would be, it would look like I'm countering this and I'm blaming a lot of the small operators is look, you are the dog that caught the car. You fought, and you got it legal. And one of the things that does look true with some of these folks is they weren't at the policy making table. That said, it's not exactly easy to get the policy-making table in California for some of these folks either. So on one hand, we can acknowledge that there's some fault to be had, but on the other hand, if we want the system to actually work, then we need to be far more open and accepting. And instead of kind of rehashing these old beefs, we need to get back together and say, all right, let's smooth it out, figure out what's it going to look like to have a sustainable system for the small and the marginalized groups. What's going to look like where we can have competition with larger groups that doesn't squash the smaller folks along the way. That's, I think, where the more constructive conversations come around, other than you guys did this, you screwed up, and what do you expect?
Great, thank you, Keith. So I think this is potentially a good spot to end things. Just making sure that no one else has any additional comments they want to say. I think we've heard a really incredible kind of suite of perspectives here from Eduardo, talking about, the state agencies and kind of the perspective of the state and the way that, labor issues are being addressed. Stella, I really appreciate the comments that you provided about kind of the real health and safety concerns that workers are faced with. There's issues around health and safety that are not necessarily being talked about broadly, certainly by illicit cultivators, but perhaps there are things that could be, if talked about more, could be addressed to workers' benefits. Amber, it's really awesome hearing about the equity programs that are underway in Oakland, and Keith's question about how they can be expanded, I think is a important point to be thinking through for cannabis and for other industries as well. What does it look like to have city-led or equity initiatives? I think is a really important point for further investigation. And then, Keith, hearing about the strategies and kind of some of the intricacies of how economic development might take place in ways that support these smallholders, and kind of the specifics of, who's in charge and what the relationship is historically between county regulators and small operators, and how kind of cultural politics can play a role in shaping how regulatory initiatives roll out, right? This idea that Mendocino is still not licensing or currently not issuing permits. Some of these decisions are not just about what regulations exist at a state level, but also how political relationships exist at local levels. And I think there's probably issues around race and economic difference and other kind of markers of difference that come into play in those conversations that also warrant further consideration. So I guess just to end things from my end, I think this project of how do we develop a equitable cannabis industry is still in the works, but there's certainly kind of interest, I think, from a variety of sectors of working in ways that support smallholders, support those who've been most affected by the drug war, and support workers going forward. So thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts and for doing this work. I look forward to seeing where it goes next.